afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this seminar as part of Cardiff University's Sustainability Week. We're really pleased to have with us today Patrick Williams from Sustrans, Robin Lovelace from the University of Leeds, and Crispin Cooper from the Sustainable Places Research Institute. So just to let you all know, this meeting is being recorded. If you have any questions, you can use the chat function or the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll come to those at the end of the talk. And with that, I will hand over to Crispin, who's going to kick us off today. So over to you, Crispin.
Hi there. I'm just checking. Alice, can you see my slides? Has everyone seen my slides? Excellent. Okay. So hi, yeah, welcome to our talk and interactive demonstration on planning, walking and cycling networks. I should introduce ourselves, myself in Cardiff and Robin Lovelace up in Leeds University. We're both academics who like to get out of our ivory tower and have a bit of an impact on the world around us, and hence getting involved in this work. Patrick works for Sustrans, the charity making it easier for people to walk and cycle, where he is National Programme Manager for the Welsh Active Travel Fund. And we're grateful to Sustrans for managing, or for arranging this opportunity for us to work together, and also to Monmouthshire Council for having the foresight to fund this pilot project. So I'm going to pass you over to Patrick to introduce the big picture here.
Hello, good afternoon. Do you want to go to the next slide, please, Crispin? So as Crispin said, I'm the National Programme Manager for the Active Travel Fund in Wales. Active Travel Fund is the primary funding source at the moment for active travel projects in Wales from the Welsh Government. So what I'm going to do is just give provide a little context to the work that Robin and Crispin have been doing. So it's really driven by this thing called the Active Travel Act, which was introduced in 2013. What that does is it provides a duty to local authorities to create what used to be called INMs, infrastructure network maps. They've now changed to another acronym, ATNM, which is Active Travel Network Map. Those are prioritized network maps for active travel, walking and cycling in specific areas, which are generally urban areas within Wales, in every local authority. And those are then used to inform and prioritise spend over a period of years, a 15-year period. And they're updated every 3 years. So, for example, the existing networks are updated. So those networks which meet the standards prescribed by the Active Travel Act are shown as existing networks. So as those are being produced and put in place, they are updated on the maps, and then the infrastructure the future routes are revisited every 3 years. In the short history that this has been going on, there have been a number of issues, and there's a question particularly really about the approach taken and the method of prioritization around spend, I'd suggest, with the mapping and the approach to network development in general. Can you go to the next slide, please? So, Active Travel Act has not been meeting the expectations that it was providing, or it was promising initially. We've not seen the uplift in cycling that you would expect to have with legislation directly aimed at uplifting active travel. That really probably comes down to the quality of the infrastructure that's going in. We know that quality and safety particularly has a big impact on people's propensity to walk and cycle. Schemes are still, I guess, arguably being proposed probably more around political expedience and the ease of development, rather than necessarily any evidence of propensity for modal shift. So as someone that assesses the bids that come in from local authorities, there are less this year, but certainly last year, a lot of bids coming through, and even for sort of big ticket numbers, where you sort of look at it and you think, where's the evidence that that's going to have any significant impact? Can you go to the next slide, please? So, question is, what are we doing about that? Well, Welsh Government is really sort of putting an emphasis on trying to drive for greater impact within the bids and the quality infrastructure that is being proposed. So it's taken a more evidence-led approach to development. So the bids require more evidence attached to them. And then the guidance also for the mapping that's the local authorities have got a duty to produce is also more prescriptive. So this year, as a funding requirement, the bids have went into Welsh Government on the 29th of January, so we've just gone through a process of assessing those. Local authorities are required to provide a case and an evidence case attached to those bids. And so we've been pushing things like the Propensity cycle tool, Robin's tool, which is open source, free to use, and suggesting very strongly that they use what is available to them to sort of consider in part the impact that routes that are being proposed and routes that are being developed have within their networks. And I guess that this is the context that we brought Robin and Crispin into the work in Monmouthshire. We're not, the view is not that we would suggest you wholly model networks, but we would certainly suggest that there's a really robust reason for putting for introducing modelling into these networks. We still go out and we walk the routes. We use a lot of local knowledge, and we will then go out and manually audit the routes as well and score the routes, as well as the modelling. There's also now a local authorities obliged to introduce engagement into their applications, so public engagement, and that was another context within the Monmouthshire work. So we've been using interactive mapping, which has been quite useful within the context of COVID, and capturing a lot of perceptions, so qualitative data, and then pulling that data together with things like the propensity, the mapping tools, to look at potential impact within these networks. And there's also an obligation of local authorities to put in monitoring and evaluation plans, which, strange as it may seem, not a lot of monitoring and evaluation really probably goes on, certainly not sufficient within the world of active travel. So that is now, there's a real focus on that. Give it the next slide, please.
Patrick, before we move on, am I right in thinking that image to the left is a screen grab from a Sustrans tool that allows people to click on a map and report what they think about the cycle network in various places?
Well, in a loose sense, that's a Sustrans tool. So that's actually ArcGIS, which Sustrans use, although Sustrans have a tool that we've developed. So we've written a bit of software, that we call the mapping tool, which is similar to tools like Commonplace. So Welsh Government has actually procured Commonplace for local authorities, or 22 local authorities to use within the mapping processes, but we've also been using our mapping tool, and we've been using that regularly, which is an open source bit of software. So you can click on the map and leave your comments. So schools, I guess the other question around this is, this work is focused on schools networks. Why schools networks? Well, there is a statutory duty for local authorities to consider schools networks as part of their network development. They're key trip generators. So schools typically will run from 200 pupils. My kids are in a school with 600 pupils in it. So high levels of traffic associated with school trips, as we know. We did the potential for modal shift is significant. We did some work very recently in Penarth that we're still doing, actually. If you look at the catchments of that particular school, Fairfield School, I think from memory, 80%, just over 80% of the students lived within a mile of the schools. The potential for modal shift is significant. But if you look at the numbers that are actually walking or cycling to school, so within the context of Monmouth, I think there was a 2% of the students that were engaged with as part of the engagement work that went along with this project said that they were cycling to school. So the potential for shift is significant. A lot of environmental impacts and concerns around schools' air quality associated with the high volumes of traffic. The relationship to the wider network is key. A lot of complex journeys associated with schools, particularly with things like the primary schools, where you get carers, often women, who are doing multimodal trips. So, and getting to understand and plan around those trips is something which we really want to get to grips with. And high schools, it's a transition thing. I mean, high schools are the time when students and children start walking, cycling to school unaccompanied on their own. So again, safe networks, absolutely fundamental to encourage these trips. Next slide. So that's really it. So quick summary, really. So context to this is the statutory duty for local authorities to produce network maps. There's a move towards more evidence-led approach. So propensity mapping has a key role to play within that. And schools offer the potential for embedding behavioural change and modal shift in a significant way.
Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, talking about our own background then, Robin and I have basically both worked on various computer simulations of active travel in our work to date. Excuse me, I'm trying to load the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and I think we see the purpose of these as twofold. It's not only to directly help planners carry out their work, but also to effectively give pedestrians and cyclists a voice in a world that is increased, it's dominated currently by simulations of motorized traffic. And so, where's the voice of the pedestrians and cyclists in that network of models? And it almost goes without saying that our overall aim is to replace as many motorized trips as we can with walking and cycling, as every substituted trip has benefits in terms of health, environment, and even helping the remaining motorized trips as well by reducing traffic congestion. So this is my own software that since about 5 years ago I've been using it. I developed it and now use it to model cycling networks. It's called Sdna. It's now used by some big engineering consultancies such as Arup, who have designed cycle networks for over 20 UK local authorities with it. And others have been doing similar things abroad. I only started with cycling in the modeling world because I'm a keen cyclist myself, but in 2019, I turned my attention to modeling pedestrians as well as cyclists by modeling a variety of different behaviors that pedestrians can have that result in different flows, whether from station to shops, between shops, or that sort of thing, combining them with machine learning to match the flows we observe and make predictions of how they change when urban layout changes. That was, I think, a world first in terms of longitudinal prediction. Robin, do you want to say a bit about your previous models?
Yeah, sure. So hi there. Yeah, my name's Robin, as Crispin and Patrick have said. I'm based in the University of Leeds, but I'm actually from Hereford, so just up the road, relatively speaking. And my role in this project is to provide good evidence for cycling potential in particular. What you can see here is an early version of our Propensity to Cycle tool. And this tool is now being deployed and it's being used by local authorities in England and Wales. And the approach is also being adopted in other countries. And what you can see from the map is basically this is about planning city scale networks. So this was partly also informed by personal experience when I lived in Sheffield, that I'd be cycling along and then suddenly the cycleway would just stop randomly, as in one of the photos in Patrick's earlier slide. So basically we need to design joined up networks, and the saying goes, a cycle network is only as strong as the weakest link. So this tool basically provides a network level representation of cycling potential based on existing travel patterns, and it estimates the potential uptake of cycling, how many people could switch from other modes, particularly car driving. And yeah, it's an evidence-based way of prioritizing investment. So next slide, please, Crispin. Yeah, so one of the limitations, I guess, of the tool so far is that it's only focused on behavior. So it's like the long-term shift, and it's very idealized. Like if we got to Dutch levels of cycling, or if we doubled cycling, what would that look like? without really going into the detail of what you would need to change in order to achieve that particular aim. So another project that we've done, which is still only in prototype mode, is this cycling infrastructure prioritization toolkit. And what that does is it combines the propensity to cycle tool layer with what's already there, and it create scenarios not of behavior change, but scenarios of infrastructure change. So let's imagine if we change this big route from a 2-lane on both ways, so like a 4-lane road, and we put some cycle infrastructure down, what would that look like? And that's one project. The most recent project is in the next slide, which is taking the propensity to cycle tool idea further, in the sense that we want to look at the potential uptake around new development sites. And this is, I think, is really important, because when you build new houses, you also build the transport infrastructure, and it's absolutely vital that people who are building these sites and approving planning permission are thinking about active travel at the earliest possible stage in the planning process. So just to provide a little bit of explanation, because there's a lot going on in this slide. What you've got in the right hand side is a map that's showing a big development site. So this is a few thousand homes that are being built in Cambridge, and you can see that the big lines are the potential routes that could be used by cycling. And then on the left-hand side, you've got an infographic showing the existing travel behaviour of people who live in the surrounding area. So actually, this is actually, compared with many sites, quite a good site. You can see the majority of the travel is within from 0 to 3 and 3 to 6 kilometres. So that's just about cyclable, and you can see that indeed there is already quite a lot of cycling activity. So it's likely that the residents of those new houses that have been built will use walking, and in particular in this location, cycling, provided the infrastructure is good enough. So that's what's shown in the next slide, which is we've on this project gone to the next zoom level, which is actually to try and simulate where all these people could be going. So you can see there's people streaming out of this development site onto the roads, and the little green dots represent cyclists, and you can see that they are streaming onto the cycle network, making good use of existing infrastructure, and then there's plenty of walking. So you can actually use this in browser. Again, it's free and open source software which allows the public to use it, and it really brings out the importance of good design and ensuring that these trips are safe and that there's not undesirable interactions between the cars, which are the red dots, and the pedestrians and the cyclists. So we're modeling this right down to the individual vehicle and person level. So that's kind of work in progress. And so far, again, this is a prototype, but it's really exciting to think how we can use this new technology to provide really strong evidence for better walking and cycling, which is exactly what we're doing on this project. So yeah, I think the next slide just gives...
It's back to me, I think.
That's back to you. Yeah, so
yeah,
back to you,
Chris. So yeah, thanks, Robin. That's all background. So on the current project, we're looking specifically at walking and cycling to schools. The background here is that in general, there's low percentages, as Patrick said, of cycling to schools. So around 1-2%, that sort of thing. And in Holland, people, about 40% of people are cycling to schools. So there's potential for a massive increase there. Walking, on the other hand, is more popular for obvious reasons, and 30 to 40% of pupils are walking to school. So then there's this question technically of what modelling approach to take, and I've drawn this little diagram with trying to balance on the right the sort of technocratic versus democratic approach to planning. And you know, it's always a question of what's the ideal balance between these. If you're really going to trust the computer, that process has to be very transparent. You can't just take a number. You have to know where that number comes from and make it clear to everyone down the chain what our assumptions are. Versus the other side of engaging participants and even eschewing computer modeling altogether and just looking at local knowledge and expertise. So in the current project, we've tried to strive for something in the middle. I mean, in the case of cycling, it's really infrastructure alone is not going to get our numbers up from 2% to 40%. It's really about a cultural shift, which is why we don't try and predict actual numbers of people who are cycling, but what we do is look at the data from Holland on how many people cycle and say, what would that look like if it happened on our roads? And maybe that's a future that we're trying to plan for and support. While good people like Patrick continue to work on the other barriers to people engaging in cycling in the UK. Walking, on the other hand, we can predict people's routes, but predicting detailed effects of infrastructure on numbers is still a matter for future research compared to what we're used to in the vehicle modeling world. We need a lot more detail, and we also have less data to work with. Another thing that comes to mind in this whole project for the planner is wondering if the focus on a single destination actually makes planning easier and makes the models easier to understand. So I'd be interested to know your feedback on this when you look at results. How are we doing for time? Nearly 1. I should try and move through this quickly, but I'd soon like to give you all the link to try this out. So what's available in the current project, we've got this Go Dutch model from Robin's previous work, which is trying to answer how things would look if we had that cultural shift. We've got various Sdna flow models of cycling where I basically try and look at the change that would happen if, hypothetically, you were to switch off all the motorized traffic. Like, where would you see the greatest increases in cycling? And those locations are places where it's perhaps a good hint that we should be providing some traffic-free routes in those locations. Likewise, looking at the walking side, we are modeling flows, avoiding crossings of major roads where possible, and also documenting the crossings themselves, because of course they present safety issues, particularly where there's, for example, informal crossings of major roads. And also looking at severance, so with this map on the right here, so I'm defining that as basically when you have to go a long way around. So you're trying to go from A to B, but the only route that's available is much less direct than the A to B path. It can be a hint for where we might need extra links in the network. In this particular example here, you could build a bridge. No one's going to build a bridge there in Chepstow because the actual demand for that link there on travel to school is low, but I understand there is a bridge under consideration further down the river. So that's it. What I will do now is paste the link to our online maps into, actually, can one of you do that? Robin, can you paste the link into the chat to the audience? In fact, it's there, and you'll need a username and password, which is on the screen. I'll have to ask you to bear with us if the system is slow, but I mean, do explore around the system, have a play and see what it looks like to you. This is the first time we've tested it with this many users, so bear with us if it's a bit laggy, and also please appreciate it is a work in progress. So if you run into errors and bugs or have other feedback on the usability, we would really like to hear from you. I mean, either raise issues in the chat here, or you can raise your hand using the button in Zoom, and not just for this, but for general questions on the modeling and everything else. And if you see bugs, feel free to drop an email reporting them to my address I've put on the screen there. So open for questions as well. And if you raise your hand, we can pass you the virtual mic to speak.
Yeah, and can I just reiterate, if you do get it working, this is the first time that we've tried having more than 1 or 2 people using it. So if you do go on that link and you manage to log on to it, please do just say on the chat if it's working. So that would be great to know. I don't know how it's going to work if we get loads and loads, but my guess is it should be fine with up to a few dozen. But yeah, please let us know on the chat if you do manage to get that working, and you should see some nice little maps there showing cycling potential to schools.
Yeah, feel free to raise a hand if you have questions. While I imagine you are probably all fighting with your browsers right now to try and load the tool. So I might take a moment to talk through the things it provides in more detail there. I mean, so yeah, essentially the Go Dutch model, which Robin might want to say more about, is about planning ahead with our infrastructure and trying to support the flows that we hope will appear one day, not only because we hope they'll appear one day, but also that the fact that we support cycling on those routes will encourage more people to cycle as part of the bigger picture that Sustrans is involved in, which also includes things like facilities at destinations, education, and so on and so forth. The Sdna models of cycling flows are perhaps a bit more optimistic than the Go Dutch ones, but as I say, the comparison is it's the change layers to the interesting ones. It's these places where we'd expect to see a lot more people if there were fewer barriers to cycling. So these are places where likely are also going to be good to have traffic-free alternatives available. And with Sdna, I forgot to say, yes, I'm also giving you layers to look at which deal with flows everywhere, so not just the flows to school. So so all between all possible origins and destinations. So this is harder to drill into and understand why we see the behavior we do compared to the flows to school, but I'd be interested to know your feedback in a moment as to what you feel you're able to learn from these different outputs. Yeah. I think that's it. That's the extra I wanted to say about that slide. Has anybody got it working yet? Do you guys have a chat available to you as panelists? I think you do. No, sorry, as attendees.
I guess there's no way of knowing if not. So
attendees can raise their hand with the right button. I'll just check that. I'm wondering if my screen share might be preventing this. I'll turn it off for the time being.
Yeah, I can see your screen. I mean, one thing we
no.
do as well.
I mean, it's possible that the screen share will. There we go.
Yeah, one thing we could do as well is do a bit of a.
Oh, hi Peter, thank you.
We could do a bit of a demo of using it as well.
We could do. I'll give it a few minutes. I think people are probably trying to log in and get it going.
And in case anyone's just hitting the screen that's given you login, the username is guest, and then the password is space letter 2 play. So
I'll bring my screen share back as long as that's not blocking the questions.
Great that I can see someone said that people can post messages on the chat, so that's good. And yeah, by all means, let us know how it's going. Good, bad, any feedback on it would be very much appreciated.
Excellent, thank you, Peter. Do you want to say a bit more about the Go Dutch scenario, Robin?
Yeah, so I mean, the Go Dutch scenario is trying to overcome this problem that if you build where you've got existing cycling, you only build for a very small fraction of the population who currently cycle. It's about 3% across the UK at the moment. 3% of trips are made by bike, and also another problem is those 3% aren't evenly distributed geographically or even demographically. So it's quite, it's the usual suspects who are cycling. So if you're in Cambridge or Oxford or York or one of the cities that has high levels of cycling, or you're a particular demographic, so usually males and people who are younger are much more likely to cycle. So if you only build for the existing cycling behavior, you risk reinforcing existing biases. So the idea is to imagine a future in which you want to build. So don't build for the past of how things were, but if we build for a future that is possible that we want to get to, that would tend to achieve the aim of having a world where everyone can use bikes for everyday transport. So yeah, go Dutch. In terms of the technical, that's the idea, is what would the transport system look like if we had Dutch levels of cycling. And then in terms of the technical methodology that we use to implement that, we got the Dutch National Travel Survey, and we ran a model that found what percentage of people would travel on a given trip. And that percentage varies depending on the distance of the trip and the hilliness. And essentially, we took those parameters that, for example, would say if you've got a 3-kilometer trip in the Netherlands, roughly 50% of people would take that trip by bike, and that's an average across the Netherlands. So in some places,
it's an impressive average.
Yeah, well, yeah, in some places you'd have higher than 50%, and in some places you'd have lower than 50%. So yeah, that's the national average, and then we translate that into the UK situation. So the same 3-kilometer trip would have, in this example, roughly 50% of travel on that particular trip would be by bike. Of course, not all trips are the same, and not all trips are equally cyclable. So if you have another trip that's 5 kilometers and really hilly, the percentage of people who could make that trip by bike, even if we had a Dutch cultural attitude towards cycling, would be lower. So accounting for distance and hilliness, it gives you an indication of how much cycling there would be. And then we run that model for every trip in our data, which in this case is trips to school. And then we use that to generate a route network that would show how much cycling activity there is down to the route network level. So roughly speaking, those numbers in the Go Dutch cycling layer represent, on a particular road or a road segment, how many students would be cycling to school on that particular segment, and that can help
also
with
by the way
and prioritizing the widths of the roads and other things. So yeah,
we got a question in the chat here as well, just to link that in, that says what period of time are the flows covering. So in this current project, that depends on the layer you're looking at. So the flows to school are all based on we were given postcode data for like how many pupils come from each postcode to the school. So essentially you can assign, you can assume that the flows to school are basically the school run times in the morning and the afternoon. For the flows between everywhere and everywhere, it's not a time sensitive model at all. And we don't have the data from the roads on the towns here in Chepstow and Abergavenny to calibrate that too. So where they come from in terms of modeling assumptions is previous work on Cardiff, which is looking at the total flow at like summing up over a 24-hour period. And it looks at, it takes into account distance of the slope and the levels of motorized traffic in deterring cyclists, and basically it then dumps those same assumptions onto Chepstow and says if Chepstow people behave like Cardiff people, these are the relative flows we expect to see. They're not actually counting numbers of cyclists with the everywhere to everywhere flows, and this is the same for pedestrians, by the way. We're not counting absolute numbers. This is something we want to get some more detail on in the future. It's basically an arbitrary scale though. So if one road has twice as much flow as another in the model, we don't know what that is, but we know which road has more flow. Have we got any further questions from people? Is anyone having any difficulty logging into the model? Is it actually working for you? Thank you, Edward. Yep. Yeah, so we've only got one layer with traffic lights in at the moment. We had some technical difficulties this week we're trying to update our entire layer system to something more user-friendly, and that was stopped partway through, so we could just push out a working version for this talk. The only traffic light layer is on the Chepstow walking layer. So if you go to Chepstow, go to walking, and I think it's called crossings, probably in that sequence. So we're trying to show quite a lot with one layer here, and I think in future we're going to have this overlaid on the actual flow layer. But the traffic lights show where there's some sort of signal or a zebra crossing, whereas the circles, in some sense, are more concern to planners because that shows where people are trying to cross the road without any assistance of that kind. And yeah, red for a trunk road or primary road, and yellow lights for a secondary and green for a tertiary. We also envisage in future being able to have a table where we can look through all this and sort and sort of prioritize, browse through the crossings that are in the system. Right, well, I'm going to thank you all for attending, and we'll stay on the line for another few minutes in case other questions come up while you're using the system. Feel free to email them through as well, but otherwise, yeah, thanks again to Sustrans for arranging, Monmouthshire Council for funding, Robin for helping with the technical side here, and thank you to all of you for coming today to find out about this system. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick, Crispin and Robin. It's really interesting to hear about it. Perhaps people need maybe a little time to play around with it themselves. Just to let everyone know, we will make this available online afterwards. So we'll share the link to the webinar once it's available online. So if you want to have a look again, learn some more, or contact any of the people involved, then you are very welcome to do so. So I think with that, we'll probably call it a day. So thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us. And yeah, join us again for another one soon. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for hosting us, Alice. Bye.
Bye-bye.